Bonjour, je suis Élisa Lachapelle, chargée de projet à l'action éducative, citoyenne et culturelle du musée 𝗙𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏. Au nom du musée, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette discussion avec l'artiste Séamus Gallagher dans le cadre de l'exposition Mother Memory Cellophane, coproduite par Momenta, Biennale de l'image. On behalf of the museum, I welcome you to this talk with the artist Séamus Gallagher as part of the exhibition Mother Memory Cellophane, co-produced by Momenta Biennale de l'image. Avant toute chose, nous souhaitons reconnaître que le musée 𝗙𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗛 est situé sur un territoire fréquenté et occupé depuis des millénaires par les peuples autochtones, lequel n'a jamais été cédé par voie de traité. The 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗟𝗢 Nation has a profound and ongoing attachment to this territory, which it calls 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗢. Acknowledging that colonialism has had devastating consequences on First Peoples, the 𝗙𝗙𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗛 Museum recognizes its duty to raise awareness and support continued vitality of Indigenous cultures. In light of their research in the museum's archives, Séamus Gallagher will present the creative process behind Mother Memory Cellophane. They will discuss how this latest creation fits into their larger body of work by drawing a parallel with previous projects. The talk will be facilitated by Maurice Fox, whose artistic practice explores many similar themes to Gallagher's: queer aesthetic, identity, gender, performativity, and hauntology. La discussion sera en anglais, suivie d'une période de questions et de réponses en anglais. Vous pouvez poser des questions sur Zoom et Facebook en français et nous pourrons les traduire en anglais pour vous. The conversation will be in English, followed by a Q&A in English. You can send us your questions on Zoom and Facebook, and we will pass them on to the artist. Merci d'être avec nous. Thank you for being with us. Now I'll turn it over to Maurice.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Elisa, for that wonderful introduction and land of acknowledgement. I'm so pleased to be here with Séamus Gallagher. I was really honored when you invited me to host this talk, and especially to talk around themes which are kind of crossovers between our work around hauntology or haunting, as well as queer aesthetics and performativity. So to start this conversation, before we really delve into your work, I just wanted to share kind of two framing quotes. One is from 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪's Queer Hauntology in the Spectrality Reader, and the other one is from Heather Davis's recent book, Plastic Matter. So 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪 says, haunting is a suspension, awaiting and attending to the world's arrivals, not as a guarantee for action in the present, but as the very force from the past that moves us, perhaps not into the future, but somewhere else. And Heather Davis says, and I think this is really relevant to the kind of history of DuPont chemicals and the hauntings that you're bringing up with your show, Mother Memory Cellophane. She says, settlers need to learn the lessons of haunting, even as we are being haunted by the material, plastics, that refuses to let us go. Reckoning may appear as haunting. So welcome, Séamus, and welcome everyone in the Zoom. And I'm just so pleased to be here. So Séamus, I had the pleasure of actually getting to go and see your show, which I know you haven't been able to go to as of yet. And I just want to kind of describe it a little bit to the viewer, to people who are on the Zoom who might not have seen the show. So going up to the 𝗙𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗛 upper floors, I exited the elevators, and this kind of soft notes of Baroque harpsichord music, it kind of enchanted me into the space of your show, which is darkly and glimmering in its setup and affect. And I first kind of went in and was confronted with the robe of Miss Chemistry herself, that yourself and I have the artist's name you constructed with Michael Zofranieri. And it's this kind of wonderful pink, blue, purple robe that is made out of a soft lenticular. And as you move around it in its dais where it's positioned, it kind of shimmers and shifts the pattern of the robe of flowers in the space. And across from it, kind of on the far end of the gallery's hall, is the video piece itself, the title piece of the show, Mother Memory Cellophane, broadcasting this kind of voice from the past that doesn't exist even. And there's these wonderful large format lenticular pieces. So lenticulars are pieces that transition from one image to another as you move past them, and the images kind of shimmer as you're moving through the gallery, going from these really wonderful manipulated photo imagery into text-based pieces and back again, as well as other pieces which are kind of notes from personal archives. I know there's the phantom stalking that you have from the kind of 30s, 40s, and some at the back end of the gallery. There was also archival footage from DuPont's chemicals explaining the process of manufacturing nylon. So with that, shall we start talking about the process that went into creating the work? Kind of what were your thought processes, and how did you arrive at this as well? Oh, sorry, there's a delivery.
All good. I will just say thank you so much for being here, and to you, Morris, as well as everybody joining. I have not had the the opportunity to see the show, as I arrived in Montreal a day before and immediately got COVID, which was very fun and quirky. However, the museum did provide really beautiful documentation, so I'm just going to share my screen to elaborate on the beautiful description that you just gave. I'll just start with the dress here. So Mother Memory Cellophane was working of ideas that I started around the pandemic, during the start of the pandemic, as the sort of ability to envision a future became very, very difficult, as we didn't know what the next month or weeks would bring. I started revisiting Mark Fisher's work, particularly around hauntology, and hauntology being this idea that our present is sort of haunted by lost futures of the past. And so during this time, I also came across the 1939 New York World's Fair and the theme of that year, which was World of Tomorrow. And I found some comfort in just revisiting this sort of envisioned future of tomorrow from 80 years past, and just seeing sort of like similarities and differences and like what would still resonate. And so during this time, I became really investigated into researching DuPont's pavilion, because world fairs are just so interesting to me. There's like a real pageantry to it, but it's also so bizarre that like companies like DuPont have the same amount of space and voices as entire countries to represent something. Mm-hmm. So DuPont's pavilion, they were announcing their newest invention, which was nylon stockings. And they had this sort of campy presentation of this actress they had hired to sort of perform a role of a mascot in a certain capacity, who's only sort of labeling through like archives as Miss Chemistry. And she was sort of perched atop this 3-tiered pedestal that I had recreated for the video, and was just showing off this newest invention. And it was just like such a bizarre image and just like a title of Miss Chemistry, but it was like such a huge hit, and nylon stockings have had like so many different associations since then. Like they were incredibly popular once they were first announced, but then as soon as they were announced, World War II broke out, and DuPont had to shift their production to creating nylon for parachutes. So they became this sort of icon of like a post-war utopic object, where there was actually a song written about longing for the days where nylon will bloom again. And that sort of somber piano harp sound that you had introduced to was actually the melody of the song playing on a loop throughout the video. So I'm happy that was the welcoming entrance to the exhibition. Sorry, you go.
No, yeah, I was just gonna say, it's so interesting that, you know, the research of Mark Fisher, who I think with hauntology, he was really thinking about soundscapes, especially. So I remember from reading that same book of his, and that section about lost futures, he's kind of listening to a British artist, Burial's soundscape, which is kind of evoking you know, the London that was meant to be, the London that can never be, and kind of all these kind of utopian ideas that have been stalled or not, actually reached us in the future, even as they were being imagined in the past. So I didn't know that that music clip was specifically from like sourced from 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪 as well. So that's a really wonderful tidbit. I'll let you keep on going because you're talking so richly about your work.
Thank you. So yeah, it's been like 2 years of researching, and I'm just so
Yeah.
happy to have made connections and have physical proof of the fact that I was doing things during the pandemic. Yeah, it's like hauntology, but also Mark Fisher's capitalist realism was a big inspiration as well, where he sort of asked the question, is there no alternative to capitalism under the state in which we work in? And that really resonated with this project as I was researching more. The 1939 New York World's Fair, it was the director of public relations was Edward Bernays, who was like the nephew of Freud. He's seen as the godfather of public relations and wrote the book on propaganda, like Propaganda 1928, he was the author of. And he sort of viewed society as needing to be controlled through sort of creating desires and sort of like selling objects to control a population and sort of manufacturing desires through the sort of like consumerist lens, which really resonates throughout the World Fair. He was the sort of architect of this one very famous exhibition for the World's Fair entitled, I believe it was Democracy or Futurama, both funny names. But it was this sort of like envisioning of the world of tomorrow as everybody owning individual cars and having the ability to drive from their sort of secluded neighborhoods into the city to work and then return to their individual sort of communities. And it was basically just suburbs. Like the world of tomorrow that was envisioned was just this concept of suburbs. But the sort of kicker of the entire exhibition is that it was funded by General Motors. So it was like this world of tomorrow that was sold to audiences as this utopic vision, but it was really structured through like corporations to sell their newest inventions, and it was very successful in doing so. And yeah, it was just a really interesting to sort of revisit without having too much knowledge of like the different exhibitions in this World's Fair and how much they resonate today, because the World's Fair was like a huge commercial failure when it was first released, just because as a world war loomed over everybody's heads, nobody could really envision what a world of tomorrow would look like. And so audience participation was quite low.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. And also, it's interesting talking about, I guess, the connections between propaganda and corporate kind of structures and power. I was thinking about kind of the soft power that was, so instead of hard power, which is the military, police, law, etc., but soft power being kind of the cultural capital that can be wielded to sometimes to create changes which are beneficial, but often are kind of cultural agendas of companies, etc. And thinking about a lot of the kind of these kind of ideas of the future which were branded between the kind of 30s and 60s, and that kind of even with fashion shows that were what is the fashion of tomorrow, with these kind of ideas of the space age woman, the space age man, in these very kind of binary, rigid ways. And I think it would be interesting to bridge to kind of what you're doing differently with this show. So by reenacting this character of Miss Chemistry as a drag performance, you're bringing this lost tomorrow back to us, but differently. It's a kind of remediation. So if you want to talk a bit more about your character of Miss Chemistry, I was really struck in the video with the kind of airy breathlessness of the voice enactment you were doing as Miss Chemistry, but then also the kind of wonderful lines of poetry in the piece as well. I wrote down fabric chewed and spat and swallowed. And I think the rest of the line is something about turning into ghost or into fog and smoke or something like that. So yeah, if you want to talk a bit more about your drag performance in this piece, but also how it ties into your practice. I know there's other characters that you've developed. That would be really great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was really struck by one of like the few materials that 𝗠𝗢𝗧𝗛𝗘 put out, sort of referring to Miss Chemistry. She was sort of spoken about as the synthetic woman of the future. And it was like this mask got created where every language to describe her was sort of inseparable from this material that she was advertising. And so it was like this interesting, like the person and the material are embedded into one, and just thinking about how I don't know, that like really resonates today as our sort of like the border between like a person and the sort of like microplastics, and the things that we ingest are much more sort of less sort of constricted as they were back then. But also thinking about this sort of like artificiality and how often that relates to queerness, and thinking about that sort of like almost non-human aspect. It really resonated with me. And so that was the sort of initial point where I wanted to sort of perform as Miss Chemistry, but then adding this sort of like spectral element. Usually when I sort of create these characters, I go through a process of 3D modeling these figures and then printing out these sort of static images onto paper and then reconstructing them physically. And for this, I sort of left the face blank, and then instead I sort of animated using, 3D modeling program Blender, using like motion capture, where I was sort of reading out the script I had written, and then the program was sort of mapping my facial movements onto this 3D model, which was then projected back in the sort of video onto myself performing as Miss Chemistry, sort of making sure I was static enough where the projection mapping would coordinate. So I don't know, I'm always interested in sort of like simulacrum, like a copy of a copy, particularly with using my sort of background in digital media. And as those sort of like copy of a copy is like translated, what gets lost and like what shifts is something that's sort of carried throughout my work. Also thinking of like specters, I don't know, like a phantasmagoria, like I feel like projection is so loaded with that. So I wanted to be able to sort of expand beyond a static image, but also the sort of projection mapping relating to the sort of ghostliness.
Yeah, no, that's really wonderful. And I found like there was something very witty about the choice, thinking about the 1930s and, the Wizard of Oz, actually, that there's this projection of a face onto a mask, which is, very kind of the Wizard of Oz, smoke and mirrors, but also has this kind of deeper undertone of kind of, if Miss Chemistry's only identity is what's projected by this corporation, then who is she really, or is there anything behind that mask? So I think that the kind of manipulations you did in terms of technology use is really kind of apt for doing that. But then the performance of your body of being like, I need to be in these certain static motions, kind of point to that higher artificiality of the construction itself. So you're revealing the curtain behind that as well. I also love that the props and the staging which appear in the video are also physically present in the gallery. It kind of collapses our understanding of the virtuality of a projected image, and it breaks it into, the scene of it. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but I was thinking about if haunting is this thing of becoming that's never quite happening, that things from the past unsettle us, demand our attention, don't go away, come back even as microplastics to kind of haunt our very, or contaminate us with them, and contaminates our understanding of what's human or not human, and the things that we manufacture, like the idea of we are what we eat even. I was just thinking about this idea of self as multiple selves through the virtual, and at the same time thinking about the performativity that you're enacting, kind of relating to this idea that 𝗙𝗘𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪 has about trans-temporal drag. Sorry, my question is very
I love it.
Whatever, but they talk about transtemporal drag as a kind of disruptive effect on our understanding of straight time, so breaking heteronormative time or patriarchal time, also as a kind of queer way of an ethics of remembrance. That's also disrupting the authority of memory itself. So in the title of your show, you can see my question is so ambling. Mother Memory Cellophane. I know from your conversation with Jamie Ross that, which was such a wonderful conversation to listen to, that the three words come from kind of there was a public poll which asked, what are the words of today or whatever, or the most evocative beautiful words, and your show has Mother Memory and Cellophane as the three words. And I was thinking a lot about memory, the memory of fabric, the memory of this material, but also I guess how drag can be used as an act that kind of disrupts our understandings of memory. So maybe if you want to talk about that, or we can move on if it's too rambling a question. Yeah.
I feel like there were so many points you made where I was like, I'm going to respond to that. But you started with this sort of quote about haunting. And then thinking of like the first quote you had mentioned about Heather Davis, I feel like resonated so much. And just, I'm going to need a second. That was great. But reading Heather Davis, she sort of talks about like 𝗙𝗢𝗧𝗛𝗙𝗪 as well, and like memory sort of accelerating through like 𝗙𝗙𝗪𝗧𝗪 referring to time eating, and how plastic sort of operates, and this sort of like accelerated like oil to a takeout container, and the sort of like quick consumption and acceleration, where I feel like, I don't know, we're just sort of like accumulating so much consumption of things that are like sort of fossilized and are finite, and it sort of like erases memory to a certain degree in just sort of like acceleration capacity. But that's a ramble, and I forget the initial question. I apologize.
No worries. And there wasn't quite an original question. So I guess if like thinking about drag and the performance that you're enacting in the show, and it's not only just the performance in the video itself, but it's also through the objects in the show. So with the lenticulars being, as you move, so through time, through the show, they transform as well, between an image and a text. I was thinking about this idea of temporal drag that can be created, or transtemporal drag, where multiple time frames kind of collapse on each other, which is what disrupts heteronormative or Western ideas of what time is in your work. So I guess that the question is really about memory, which you answered already kind of, and this idea of memory eating is so fascinating to me. So you talk about that if you want to.
I think like the aspect of lenticular is really important to me, just because it operates as its own form of haunting, in where like nothing, whatever you see is like not necessarily what is entirely present, and it's sort of impossible to grasp the entire thing from like one fixed position or like at one specific point. And so that was a really important part that I wanted to have like throughout the exhibition itself, up and including the costume, which I don't know, I had designed this pattern of a sort of like 3D sort of cellophane flower blooming, and then I sort of extracted stills of that to create this sort of this lenticular shifting dress. But I think it also operates as a sort of iridescence, and like mimics a sort of like oil spill quality in the way that the colors will like shift depending on the point of view it's looked at. And I think like this spillage is something that is also like a through line throughout the exhibition, of like the parts that make out the set from the video spilling into the gallery, and the nylon stockings within the packaging spilling out from outside of it, which this packaging, I was lucky enough to do a residency at the McCord-Stewart Museum leading up to the exhibition. And Alexis Walker, who works within the sort of costume garment department of the museum showed me this incredible packaging that they had from the 40s. And this was sort of like the starting out point of the exhibition, seeing this sort of connection of nylons and ghosts and this like really haunting image. And so, yeah, that was the first sort of image that I created for this exhibition. Sorry, that was a bit of a derailment.
No, I love a derailment, as you can tell from this conversation. Can you go up 2 slides to just the detail of the fabric on the dress? So I think one of the things which was so interesting is that there's such a fluidity of the fabric, and it suggests this kind of liquid spilling, oil slick effect, but it's actually quite rigid as a material, which I found in your performance really evoking as this kind of like checking in on the position of the dress so it's just right, pointing at the camera. And the flower motif is really interesting too, of thinking about, you know, flowering or something that blooms is also, you know, algae blooms, oil blooms, you know, all these kind of blooming as something that can be toxic as well as something that's natural or etc. And I think there's a kind of unbounding or contamination that you do between, you know, what we've understood as divided between the natural and the artificial, but also between, you know, it's a kind of queer ecological lens of looking at all of the things that we've created, not only as objects of desire, but also as objects of contamination, and how those two things kind of aren't at binary oppositions, but actually cross-contaminate with each other. I want to segue back a little bit to your work with the archives. If you want, I also love doing archival work, and often it's a starting point in my own practice. So doing that kind of research is often so enriching going into the creation of work. And I wanted you to talk a bit maybe about the things you discovered in the archives beyond just this one moment and how that influenced the actual image making for you.
Yes, this is the first project I really did that was inspired by a certain specific era, a specific time period for me to pull from. And what was really beneficial was I really focused on DuPont's archives, their sort of history of the creation of nylon, because just the like mere sort of invention of nylon is sort of haunted in its own way. Like the chemist who invented the material was like an extremely depressed person and didn't live to see the sort of patent of nylon as stockings and what it is today, because he committed suicide due to his depression. And there's just like so many different facets in which the sort of like associations with nylon have shifted over the years that I was really inspired by, as like seeing it from this utopic post-war object to the 50s. There's documentation of, in Toronto, the air pollution was so bad that women would walk to work, and by the time they went into office, the air had eaten and chewed away at the nylon stockings. And so at that point, nylon stockings became this sort of like canary in a coal mine to sort of regulate like toxic air emissions. And up until now, I mean, I think what I associate nylon with most is it's like the biggest polluter in the ocean, what's known as ghost gear. Nylon ropes are just discarded and then continue to sort of trap fish, and then just like go to the bottom of the ocean and emit microplastics. So yeah, I was just really interested in sort of using the World Fair as a starting point, and then looking throughout the history of DuPont and nylons and their many different sort of associations throughout time.
Yeah. When I did a plastics cleanup, so an oceanic beach plastic cleanup in 2019 when I was in Iceland, just as part of what I was doing there and as a research. And I think one of the really striking things along the beach that you kind of come to realize is there's two types of products which make themselves visible compared to everything else that's already being broken down and turned into microplastics. And one of them is ghost gear, and the other is kind of domestic or objects that we associate with domesticity. So, laundry detergent jugs and toothpaste tubes and personal items, also like personal hygiene items. So I think there's a really lovely collapse of, or a poetry to it, even as it's extremely devastating, to kind of think back to, the origin points of this material that was seen as miraculous, as a material of tomorrow that, in fact does have all these kind of wonderful effects, but at the same time, these terrible consequences because of our own inability to regulate how they're used and where they end up. So the whole life cycle of these things. So plastic itself becomes a kind of disruption, or talking about dragging to drag nets. Ocean drag nets are devastating to the oceans, and to all of us by association. So I think there's a really great kind of in your show nuance to how you're approaching the material. And then recently I discovered that both of us have read this book, Shimmering Images by Eliza Steinbach, which she talks about shimmering as not being able to look at an image or an object just from one perspective, that you have to look at it from multiple perspectives. And I think the lenticulars really lend to that. I haven't read the book since the fall, so it's been a moment. So I don't want to put either of us on the spot for our knowledge about that. But definitely thinking about shimmering as this kind of things in transition or transformation, and the kind of ungraspableness of trying to look at something directly when it can't be known directly.
Yeah, I think that's really like the sort of era we live in as well. Just everything in flux, and sort of having to sort of confront the mutation that's sort of embedded within like multiple crises happening, unfolding at once. There's no one fixed position, which I feel like for so long, in like seeing these sort of new innovations as like the material of the future, it's been such like a static, specific future. Like there was advertisements, I believe, for the sort of like world's fairs where it's sort of envisioning the fashion of the future. And I remember one that I think might have been specifically DuPont, where it was showing off the costumes of the future, all for white women. And then there was one single like woman of color who was relegated to a maid outfit that was like the current day, like in the 30s, the sort of outfit. So it was like, who was allowed into these futures? Who are they for? And who do they serve? And I think as we're sort of seeing the sort of like colonial like extraction, consumption, and then disposal, this disposal come back and haunt us, that sort of we're seeing like that, the realities of that violence of extraction and self-serving consumption.
No, definitely. And I think that was one of the things which was so great about reading Heather Davis's book, is, she kind of introduces it with a personal family history, which is that I think it's her grandfather worked for DuPont and was the person who invented or patented the kind of ubiquitous Canadian milk bag. So, bags of milk that come in pairs of 3, and kind of her own reckoning with her own history or involvement, her familiar involvement with that, and kind of the wonderful life that he got to live, but at the cost of who, and that's just one person amongst many, and I think we all, as or as a white settler, I benefit from these systems which propose a future which isn't even necessarily the future we want for as you were saying, a very limited percentage of the world, while leaving most of the world, so the global majority of the South, for example, to face lost futures or the consequences of these kind of utopian dreamings from the 30s and 40s, which are still proposed and ongoing. So even thinking about greenwashing, for example, and this is a bit of a segue out of your show, but thinking about, well, if we all shift to using electronic cars, but where are the minerals that are needed for these cars mined, and it's in the Congo where there's a current genocide happening. So and I don't want to get too dark here because we're talking about your show, but I think that's something that I've been thinking about or grappling with a lot as a kind of what do we consume and how does that also consume us, is something I've been thinking a lot about. So perhaps to segue from that, though we can talk about it more as well, I was thinking maybe we can talk a bit about queer aesthetics in general and within this show, but also kind of back form to other works of yours as well, if you want to bring them up. One of the things I really love about the show is there's a lot of references to kind of 1980s and 1990s queer aesthetics, which are drawn from political action. So kind of these all of the word text pieces that are embedded within the lenticulars, and then also how these aesthetics are drawn from kind of longer histories of queer embodiment, of camp, of drag, of ball culture, etc. Maybe you want to talk about that a bit more. So
so I think I can say with confidence DuPont's an evil corporation. That being said, their advertisements are sometimes very camp, and that really drew me in visually. Just this sort of bizarre figure of a woman called Miss Chemistry on top of this 3-tiered pedestal. It's I was just so drawn to that sort of imagery and how bizarre it seemed. And so I think my aesthetic is always rooted in camp and sort of queer visual languages. That's the sort of background that I will always pull from. And so I find it to be a pretty productive tool to create an engaging visual environment, and then sort of using that as the sort of entry point to maybe more difficult or complex topics that sort of revolve around the research I was doing for this exhibition. I think that's just sort of always, that's my sort of wheelhouse, and I can't imagine myself working outside of it. I just always sort of want to expand upon those inspirations.
Yeah, I think camp aesthetics definitely are within my own wheelhouse too, and along with over adornment or trying to overburden artwork with meaning, sometimes to a point of failure, which can be both comic and tragic at the same time. I read before I went to my MFA, so kind of the thing that drew me to it, a text by Joelle McSweeney called The Necropastoral, and she talks about Jack Smith's kind of failed film project, which he never completed, but it includes things like painting the entire ground a brighter green because the grass wasn't the right color. So this kind of high artificiality to a point of kind of exhausting the possibility of the material. And I think it's interesting to look at kind of a camp aesthetic, not only as where it's being kind of appropriated by popular culture, or I think about the Met Gala's kind of camp thing as a failure. It's not camp because it's the Met Gala, but kind of looking at its origins, which are about, Black, queer, trans people cobbling together whatever they can with the available resources at the time to kind of create these fantasies for themselves. And I think one of the things that's interesting as emerging artists is we're also not, affluent companies like DuPont, and we're not starlets going to the Met Gala for whatever reasons. I don't know why our invitations got lost in the mail. So I think there's something really interesting about, camp as improvisational, as well as camp as something that kind of peels away the artifices of the society that surrounds us, which is one of the things I really loved about your show, is this kind of camp sensibility,
Thank you. Yeah, I think like artifice is something that is a through line throughout my work, and like peels away at the sort of artifice, but also sort of embraces it at the same time, is something I always find like a fruitful starting point. And I was just like really grateful to be able to provide this sort of camp drag aesthetic into like such an institution like the McCord. And while I didn't get to see the exhibition, I did get to drive past seeing my like leg outstretched in nylon stockings with like my green nails outside of the building, which was a real joy to see.
Yeah. No, it's kind of amazing to see your own images then recast as billboards, so they're an advertisement for your own show, and it's kind of a full circle of the aesthetic, but then also like what are the troublings that those do to, I certainly think about queer visibility right now, in Canada as well as the US and around the world, where our lives are being threatened. And so to have your show and to have this giant billboard of queerness outside the McCord is quite remarkable.
Yeah, I also think that was like a really important theme in Ji Yoon-han's like biennial sort of thematic, which was masquerade drawn to metamorphosis, and thinking of like the sort of when is visibility important and when is invisibility important, like visibility versus protection. And so visibility, but also I am always wearing a mask in any project I do as well.
Yeah. It's also interesting. I mean, I've never worked with this material, but DuPont also, having nylon be this strong yet delicate synthetic fabric, and then Kevlar being another one of their well-known products. So, thinking about, is clothing or is drag a form of armor? And, can it also be a form of camouflage? Which certainly one of my mentors, 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪𝗏 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗍𝗏 kind of speaks about in her own work. So she did this whole collection of Afrofuturist camouflage coats, which are just really spectacular, and different renditions of them. And so thinking about, I guess it's a question of, at what point does visibility become, a target on our back? And at what point does visibility also become a protective armor for us as queer people?
Exactly.
Or other marginalized people. Yeah.
I think, back to like living in an era of flux, that feels like it's so precarious and can change on the day as well.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I love about going out to queer nightlife events, and I think this was something that during the pandemic was really felt as a loss or an absence, is being able to go out and be, dress up in the armor and celebration of our queerness with other queer people. And I think in the pandemic, a lot of us kind of shifted to online modes because those were available, thinking about club quarantine, or I started going to kind of virtual reality raves as well. And I know this isn't necessarily within this show, but with recent other work that you produced, it kind of came out of kind of being inspired by queer virtual selves and video game aesthetics. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit as we kind of draw close to Q&As.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I grew up in Moncton, New Brunswick, which has historically not been the most progressive area of Canada. And so I really did rely on like digital spaces to find community. And one of the very first ones was like online video games, where I wasn't sort of burdened with myself. There was the sort of like active performing that was sort of embedded into the sort of avatar space. And so, I've like always been thinking about that sort of initial digital space where I was able to sort of experiment with my own identity, to sort of my interest in the past several years with drag as the sort of fantastical embodiment of something else. And that's sort of like how I came to develop this practice of sort of 3D modeling these drag-inspired characters and then being able to sort of convert them into paper to then like reconstruct with my scrappy little hot glue gun and perform with in like photo video spaces. And yeah, that's always been a through line in my work as it carried on to, I'm trying to be more intentional in the sort of characters I create. So for this one, the ghost of Miss Chemistry.
Yeah. No, I love that. And thank you for speaking about that. You know, my own artwork kind of also explores virtuality or queer virtual reality as a kind of site of, you know, both failure of community. You know, certainly we're prone to our own trolls and, you know, online bullying, hate, etc., as well as within our own communities that we create in these online spaces. We can reinforce kind of, you know, things that are already happening or not being enacted against us. So they become, you know, inclusionary to some, but exclusionary to others. But I think there's something really wonderful about the virtual as being something which is about potential. So potential of gender, potential of sexuality, potential of queerness in general, of, you know, being able to enact some part of ourselves that we can't do in the physical world, or it's not safe to in some cases too, right? So thinking about your background growing up in Moncton, or, you know, even for me in Toronto in the late 90s, it wasn't the safest space to be queer either. So yeah. Well, it's 12:45. Should we, do you want to have a last comment and then we'll open it up to questions?
I guess I'd say I'm like very grateful for this conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to think of all those thoughtful questions. I think there's like a great resonance between sort of ideas we explore in very different ways. And yeah, thank you so much for chatting.
Oh my God, Séamus, thank you so much for inviting me to chat. It's just been such an honor. And, you know, we followed each other online for a while, but getting to share the space has been profound and just the best. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, Séamus, for accepting to do this artist talk and to think about more ways to host it. It was really interesting. There are so many things that are going on in this exhibition. And I want to invite the public, people listening, if they have questions, we have time for that. You can write them in the chat or the Q&A section on Zoom or in the chat of Facebook. We don't have any questions for the moment, but let's let people time to to ask their questions. And so have you two worked together before, or like how
Just
do you
Instagram
know?
pals.
Yeah, just
Okay.
Instagram pals. Yeah, yeah.
Morris has been very helpful with just providing so many like theoretical references and different essays for me to read as I've sort of explored ghosts and hauntings, and it's been really, really helpful.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great.
Just, yeah, wonderful, you know, DM chats. And yeah, so this has been a pleasure to finally get to chat.
So I have a question from Meg Fox. I don't know if...
Oh, salut ma mère. Hi, Mom.
So she asks, I'm really interested in the unintentional invocation of camp aesthetic by 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗏. Love to hear more of your thoughts on that. Do you want me to read it again?
Yeah, sorry, do you mind?
Yeah. I'm really interested in the unintentional invocation of camp aesthetic by 𝗙𝗢𝗏. Love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel like that was just like what initially gravitated me towards this entire thing. And I think DuPont in the 60s even put out like musical commercials. And so this sort of advertising, I don't know how it was read at the time, but revisiting it from a standpoint where I think we can all agree it's like such a evil corporation, but with this like very unconvincing facade of cheeriness, I was really drawn to, and sort of using that as like an aesthetic like initial grounding point to jump off of was really important. Camp's just always been like a through line throughout a lot of my work, and I think of like camp as this sort of like sincere attempt to reach the certain level of glamour, but failing to do so. And there's like a new aesthetic that's drawn from it. And so that's been something that I've always really drawn to, that sort of failure aspect that, yeah, really speaks to me. Thank you so much for the question. Nice to meet you.
We have 3 more questions. I don't know if you're able to see them in the Q&A, the Q&A section on your screen, but I will read them for everyone. But maybe like with my so-so English, maybe if you can read them, it will help you to answer them as well. So we have Amanda Shore, who asks, she says, "Hi everyone. Séamus, I know you worked with lenticular print before, but what was it like transitioning into lenticular fabric?"
It was a difficulty. Sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Is it still sharing?
No.
Oh, okay, amazing. Sorry. It was a technical difficulty. Fortunately, I worked with an angel, Michael 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗡, who was able to like construct the garment and sort of it was like an iron-on fabric. So he sort of constructed this costume and then would iron on the pattern to sort of seamlessly match it. It was a difficulty for sure, but I really wanted that sort of seeing like the sort of lenticular walk, like moving from left to right, to see it in more of like a sculptural aspect of sort of shifting and less of like a rigid aspect. I like really wanted that effect, and fortunately he like did it successfully. I was really happy with how it came out.
And so for the next question from Austin Anderson, thank you for the talk, Séamus and Maurice. I was wondering if you could speak a little more on this boundary between garments as armor, camouflage, versus as a method of exposure. The nylon stocking also has some sexual kink connotations. And Maurice, your chainmail work seems to explore these boundaries between exposure versus armor as well. How do you negotiate the boundaries in your work?
Séamus, do you want me to answer this one? Yeah, so I also was the one who brought up armor camouflage, so I feel like I should answer it. So yeah, I think, you know, there's these two things. One, when we arm ourselves or garb ourselves in clothing, obviously any piece of clothing is a protective shell that we wear to help against certain types of exposures. Thinking about specifically how that relates to, sorry, the question was answered, so I just want to keep it popped up, to exposure or camouflage or as armor. I think that, you know, being visibly queer or wearing particular things that are identify us as queer compared to a normative identity is both a way of protecting ourselves against heteronormativity or compulsory heteronormativity, specifically where, you know, we are arming ourselves in spite of the violence that is enacted on us, despite the straight gaze that looks at us and others us. But at the same time, that increased visibility isn't always wanted, or it brings increased violence against us. So thinking about camouflage as well as this kind of high visibility camp fabric that simultaneously kind of might mask us, might hide us, and in fact thinking about it as this fabric that we associate with, you know, Duck Dynasty and enactments or performances of masculinity, but how that kind of gets queered in certain works. I think within the kink connotations and the ideas of boundaries or exposure, just briefly in my chainmail practice, I think of it as one, a protective shell, but it's also perforated metal, like there's gaps between it. So even though it might protect against certain types of violence, it doesn't actually protect from environmental or atmospheric effects. So, you know, it looks like armor, but it's not at the same time. Yeah. Thanks, Austin, for your question.
Another one from Camille Zoe Valcourt-Snot. Hi both. Thank you so much for this generous conversation. It's been wonderful to hear more about your work. Séamus, I know you perform for the camera in many of your works, and I'm wondering if you ever considered performing live. Thanks.
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much for that question. I have considered it, and I've actually done it while in Pittsburgh. I feel like, Maurice, you had mentioned the sort of like, I don't know, gathering in like queer spaces that was sort of lost during the pandemic. And that was like really felt in the Maritimes. But now that I'm in a new city, I have this sort of privilege of anonymity. So I've been able to perform in gay bars as like within a drag context without any sort of pressure of success versus failure, as just like another way of performing and like finding a new queer community while I'm in a new city. And so, yeah, I see them as sort of like two separate, they serve two separate purposes, where like within the sort of context of like a visual arts capacity, I can get away with different things than I can at performing in like a gay queer space. And so I find they're both like very sacred and important, but yeah, I like the sort of differentiation.
Yeah. No,
do you perform?
Yeah, I do. I was going to say, so a lot of my performances started out as physical performances that often are videographed. So I think about the hanky code. There's a flagging code, which is performance for camera. And it's you're meant to have a piece of black velvet in your pocket. So my kind of thesis work was all black velvet robes, which I kind of did fiber etch processes with. And since my MFA, I've moved slowly towards doing virtual performance instead, partially because as I get older, I have to think about how my body is breaking down, but also I think, you know, as the pandemic has lifted to a certain amount, I've started thinking about how can I incorporate things that I learned or have done in virtual reality into my physical performances. So last summer, I got to perform for Lots of Love Festival in Montreal, which was curated by a collective, including 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪. And so I kind of did a call and response live theater, which was based on ideas of bringing virtual elements into the real world, because of course, the real world and the virtual world are one and the same in many ways. They're mirrors of each other. So, yeah.
And another question. Well, thank you for your answer on that question. And thank you, Camille, for your question. Another question from Barry Lazare. So he's coming back on 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗟𝗢𝗪 advertising. Are you familiar with The Wonderful World of Chemistry that was written in 1964, which was a Broadway-style industrial musical review about nylon, mylar, etc.?
Yes, that was what I was trying to reference earlier. This, yeah, very, very camp sort of Broadway style, as you said, musical. I find those to be really interesting to look back on as our sort of relationship with these materials have changed. Like seeing them in the most celebratory light possible reads a lot different today, but they're still like very funny sort of time capsules.
Great. Well, thank you. That's all. We don't have any more questions, but they were all very interesting. And I want to thank everyone who asked a question and everybody who was attending during this lunchtime to the artist talk. So I don't know if there's one last word you want to say before we say goodbye.
I'll just quickly say thank you once again to Maurice, but thank you as well to the museum for all the support throughout this exhibition. And thank you, Elisa, for organizing this as well.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much. And so we hope to see you soon at the museum, both of you.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, and bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for watching.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.